Welcome back to Epic Literature. This week we're continuing Homer with his classical sequel, the Odyssey. The Iliad begins with the question, what is more important? Position, figured by Agamemnon, or merit, symbolized by Achilles? What is it that makes the world turn? Is it kingship and political power? Or is it the soldiers who serve the king? The Odyssey definitively answers this question with the latter. I termed this work a sequel, and it is in the sense that it covers the same geographic areas of the Mediterranean, has a number of the same characters and the same themes, but it is also certainly a self-contained work, meaning you don't have to have read the Iliad beforehand, though it certainly helps. It takes place 10 years after the fall of Troy. Achilles is dead. Agamemnon made it home to Greece, but was killed by his wife and her lover soon after his arrival. But Odysseus has still not returned to Ithaca. He was shipwrecked on the way back from Troy by Poseidon, who has nursed a grudge against Odysseus for coming up with the ruse of the Trojan horse, infiltrating and destroying Troy. The text is divided up into several sections. We begin with Odysseus' son and wife, Telemachus and Penelope, who are struggling with what to do about Penelope's suitors. Since Odysseus has been given up for dead, his kingship of the city-state Ithaca is up for grabs, and only Penelope can confer the honors through marriage. She has refused to give up on Odysseus, but that hasn't stopped her many suitors from trying, and hospitality demands that she and Telemachus provide them with food and lodging, which they sorely abuse by sticking around for years, consuming Odysseus' wealth. Telemachus leaves to get help, while Penelope famously weaves a burial shroud for Odysseus' father Laertes, who is not yet dead. Once it is complete, she has agreed to marry one of the suitors, but each day she weaves, and each night she undoes all her work. Penelope becomes the Grecian example par excellence of fidelity. In the meantime, Odysseus has been stranded on an island for 7 years with the nymph Calypso. She is in love with him, and promises to give him everything he could possibly desire. But all that he desires is to go home. Most of the text is Odysseus' Odyssey, or his retelling of his Odyssey, through the Mediterranean world. We see in his character things only glimpsed at in the Iliad. In many ways, Odysseus becomes not only a foil, but an antithesis of Achilles. If Achilles is characterized by wrath, then Odysseus becomes the paragon of prudence, craft, and skill. Chief among Odysseus' adventures, where he needs to use wisdom instead of brute force, are his encounter with the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens, and the Cyclops. Things and characters that you're probably familiar with in popular culture, even if you've never sat down to read the Odyssey. Now, each of these tales is interesting in their own right. But perhaps most revealing is Odysseus' descent into the underworld. This motif of the katabasis, the epic descent, will show up in future epic literature as well. In Odysseus' katabasis, he comes to the house of the dead and speaks to the prophet Tiresias after a libation of blood. Tiresias, by the way, will play a recurring role throughout Western literature as a sage figure. Among others, he meets his mother Jocasta, and women who give a genealogy of Greek history and myth, which is one account after another of sorrow. He also meets Agamemnon, slain by his own wife. And he meets Achilles, who surprisingly regrets his decision to go to Troy and wishes he was still alive. Pay careful attention to each of these interactions in Book 11 and ask yourself what Odysseus discovers about truth in both the spiritual and material worlds. Because the spiritual and the material are always at work in the Grecian worldview, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. Students of Homeric epic are struck by the many stories of the gods that fill the pages. Indeed, it has been said by more than one critic that Homer's epics form a sort of Grecian version of the Jewish Bible, a kind of compendium of Grecian mythology. And we know that these stories were considered culturally significant, because Plato and Aristotle draw on them constantly when using illustration. It is also true that Plato and Aristotle are attempting to lure people away from these stories by philosophically and reasonably proving them false. But the fact that they draw on them so frequently demonstrate how ingrained Homer was in the minds of the average Greek. Like the Iliad, the Odyssey shows how much the gods are at work in the lives of mortals, though in contrast to the providentialist view, they are often at odds with mankind. As but one example, Athena, goddess of wisdom, does all that she can to help Odysseus reach home, while Poseidon, god of the sea, does all that he can to swallow Odysseus up in his waves. Which god should I serve? Often becomes a question of the Greeks. So important questions to consider in this text are, for one, like with the Iliad, who do the gods reveal themselves to be? What is their nature and their character? And how are they often at odds with one another? Number two, what defines the heroic character in the Odyssey? Is this significantly different than what we see in the Iliad? Or are these traits complements of one another? Number three, what is the view of the family in Homer's estimation? Think about the many relationships and how they're depicted with each other. For instance, what is the obligation of fathers and sons, as we see depicted between Odysseus and Telemachus? What is the importance of marital faithfulness between husbands and wives, as we see depicted with Odysseus and Penelope? And what is the importance of continuing the legacy of one's forebears, as we see depicted in Odysseus and Laertes? Number four, what is the meaning of home? Why does Odysseus reject Calypso's offers of a near-perfect life in exchange for the hope, not the guarantee, of returning to Ithaca? Number five, as we look at Penelope and Telemachus, what is the role and what are the limits of hospitality in the ancient world? Why is this such an important character trait? Number six, what is the Homeric view of death and the afterlife? Who does Odysseus speak to, and what does each of them teach him about life, death, and afterlife? And finally, number seven, how does the Odyssey contrast its predecessor text as it regards the themes of chaos and order? Godspeed your reading.